Welcome back to this week's edition of the MintCast, the official podcast of Mint Press News. I am Whitney Webb, and joining myself and co-host Alan McLeod today is investigative journalist and author Yasha Levine. Yasha has written for outlets such as Wired, Slate, The Nation, and Time magazine, and was also editor of the Moscow-based English-language satirical news site The Exile, and was also a contributor to Pando. Today we will be discussing his most recent book, Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet, which was released in 2018, but a year later is still as relevant and important as ever. We will also touch on Yasha's recent articles on Russiagate and how it has created a wave of racist xenophobia in the U.S. that has been widely overlooked. Welcome to the program, Yasha.
Thanks for having me on.
So, Yasha, it's Alan here. You start off your book with a claim that would probably shock a lot of people who generally believe the internet has been a liberatory tool. You start in the 1960s and claim that computers and the internet were developed as a response to the growing radicalism of the era and were designed as a way of trying to preempt democratic uprisings and keep a lid on social discontent. This idea that the internet was designed by the government to be a weapon of elite social control from the very start was pretty much completely new to me. Could you explain it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of what my book does is actually recover a lot of old history that has been forgotten. It doesn't really try to write new history, but recovers stuff that was known to people and apparent to people in the 1960s and early 1970s when the internet was first being created. And so, one example that I like to go to is a protest at MIT and Harvard in 1969 that was specifically against the ARPANET. So the ARPANET is this the kind of the first version of the internet. That was the military network created by ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. We now call it as DARPA. It's sort of this lab to create advanced weapons for the Pentagon, and ARPA created the internet technology that we all use today, and it was deployed at first as the ARPANET. It was a military network, connected all these different sort of military think tanks, universities that were doing military research and doing computer science research, and it went online in 1969, and that same year, students at MIT and Harvard were protesting it already, and were calling it a technology of sort of people manipulation, and we're calling it a technology of political control that was designed to target left-wing and radical movements in America, but also around the world. They saw this technology as something that was not designed to liberate people. That it was the furthest thing from their mind. They couldn't even imagine someone talking about computers and computer networks as tools of liberation. They saw them as tools of control and specifically sort of American political control.
Okay, so speaking of ARPANET then, do you think the privatization, I guess, of ARPANET that sort of happened in the 1990s that sort of moved it from this government project or Pentagon project to sort of like this this mix of private companies and internet service providers and all that we really have today, do you think that privatization was necessary for the internet to sort of become as widely used as it is today, but still remain as a surveillance and counterinsurgency, weapon, so to speak, that the people in the U.S. military that created ARPANET had long envisioned?
That's a good question. I guess it probably, yes. I imagine that, with the current way that sort of America's economic system and sort of research and development system is set up, privatization usually happens when a technology sort of reaches a stage that can be marketed, that could be marketed for consumers, or that where companies could make money off of the technology, right? It's usually spun off, and the internet, went kind of two different ways, but then these ways kind of never really parted, or it seemed like it went two different ways, but then they never really parted. So the internet was sort of developed in early 1970s, and then it was basically almost immediately when the proof of concept was shown to work, that you could create this sort of decentralized network that it could link all these different computers in the U.S. government, in the Pentagon, that you didn't have to have build these sort of specific networks for specific purposes, but you could have a general use network that could connect any computer and allow them to talk to each other. That was the big breakthrough that the internet made. So the internet was immediately absorbed into operational networks of the Pentagon, of the NSA, of all these different Pentagon sort of communications networks, right? At the same time, it was kind of started going commercial, right? And it was more and more companies were providing internet services, early type of internet services to universities, to corporations that wanted this kind of connectivity as well. And as that became more ubiquitous and merged with sort of the personal computer revolution that made personal computers cheap and accessible to just about anybody, right? The internet really started to go like global, and that really started happening in the 90s and the early 2000s. And while these two internets seemed like they were diverging, the sort of the military internet and this privatized, commercial internet, they actually had never really diverged, because the way that the ARPANET technology and the internet technology works is that it allows any network that speaks the same kind of language, right, to connect with each other. And so the two things were always there together, right? Even though they were kind of logistically separate, they could always interconnect, and the two things could always interconnect. And so, to go back to your question, was the privatization, necessary to help make the internet the sort of surveillance network, the ubiquitous surveillance network? Yeah, probably, because you really needed to have people use it and on a mass level, right? If people didn't really use this network, it can't really be used for surveillance purposes or couldn't be. And so, the more that the internet became commercial and the more widely it was used by people, right, the more effective as it became as a surveillance technology, because it wasn't just something that allowed the government to transfer data between data centers, right, and connect things together within the government, but that the internet became, in essence, a tool that collected the intelligence, right, that sort of self-monitored, that people did stuff on the internet, like we're doing now. We're talking on a podcast over the internet. People date on the internet. People, right, they buy stuff on the internet. They organize politically over the internet. Do everything on the internet these days, right? And have pockets, in their pockets, phones connected to the internet. So the internet became ubiquitous, and the more ubiquitous it became, the more effective and useful as a surveillance technology it became, right? Because back in the early days when the internet was being developed, you still had to gather the intelligence externally to the network, right? And you had to input the information into the network. So the ARPANET, the early internet, was used to spy on Americans, like going back to the early 1970s. But it wasn't used to collect information. It was used to input the information and to transfer it and share it between intelligence agencies, and to compile dossiers and all things like that. But the information, let's say on anti-war protesters, on civil rights activists, had to collect it externally by human agents out in the field infiltrating, collecting data and then inputting into the system. That's sort of the old way. But as the system went commercial and penetrated every part of our life, that surveillance became kind of built into the system, right? You didn't need to input it anymore. It just collected it automatically.
Talking about surveillance, you really seem to have a real problem with Google, Yasha. Aren't they just friendly, cool guys in California offering us free services? I mean, their motto until recently, anyway, was "Don't be evil." I mean, you seem to be claiming that this was never an accurate representation of what they were about. Aren't huge companies, monopolies like Google and Facebook, our friends in the end?
I mean, I don't think I'm the only one who has a problem with Google these days. I think everyone is hating on Google and hating on Facebook, or a lot of people are, for all sorts of reasons, including people who are blaming, these companies for basically electing Donald Trump. Look, I mean, I don't think that Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the co-founders of Google, who met in Stanford and were these kind of smart engineering kids and math kids, I mean, I don't think they set out to create a surveillance, a for-profit surveillance monopoly, that they didn't set out to create this, giant company that's totally integrated with the U.S. national security state. I don't think that was their goal. They were just out, two engineering kids who wanted to make something cool, who were looking for a PhD project and wanted to make money when they graduated, right? And so, by the nature of the sort of the course that their research took, and the structure of Stanford, and the programs that were available at the time, and the problems that existed for engineering and computer science kids like them, that existed to be solved by people like them, at the time, sort of, led them into that direction. A lot of it is kind of accidental and just happen chance, right? It's not like a preordained. There's no conspiracy here to create this thing, and so but just the structure of the way that government-funded research into computer science, and the way and the structural forces of the American economy and the American markets and Wall Street, right? The way that they work together basically produced this abomination. And Google is not the only one. Facebook is right there with it. You have companies like eBay that rarely get a mention. Amazon is there as well, right? So is Twitter. So any of these companies, right? They came out of different places. They were driven by different. The people who founded them had different goals in mind, right? But ultimately, they all kind of, as they became big and became ubiquitous and everyone started using them, they ultimately merged with the national security state, or became much more, went into much closer partnership with the national security state, and ultimately made most of their money, or a lot of their money, depending on the company that we're talking about, through surveillance, through for-profit surveillance, through watching users, through trying to predict what they're going to do, through amassing huge databases on user behavior and profiling people. So, Google is a huge company. It's an extremely influential company. It really changed the market in a way for the internet, because it was the first one to introduce a new kind of business model for the internet, and business model that was based on trying to predict what people are going to do on the internet, what people are thinking about, so to maximize the probability that they click on an ad. And they pioneered that, and a big part of that was to actually try to watch what people do online, to build predictive models of user behavior, so that you can know as close as possible to what they're thinking about while they're searching or browsing the internet, so you can show them the relevant ad at the relevant time to maximize the probability that they'll click on that link and make that 10 cents for Sergey Brin. And so that model was adopted by Facebook. Facebook was adopted by pretty much everybody, and they pioneered that on and showed that could make real money. And combined with a monopoly position in the ad business, or a near monopoly position, you could really start to make a lot of money by merging predictive surveillance technology with advertising. And so that's what they did, and that's kind of the world that we live in commercially. And of course, that technology very, very well pairs with this sort of counterinsurgency, fever dreams of the U.S. national security state that wants to predict and prevent any kind of political or social upheaval with the help of the internet.
Right. So,
or to cause it sometimes, right? Depending on which region of the world we're talking about.
Right. That's true. So, on your last point there, something you touch on in your book is about how a lot of these big Silicon Valley companies, including Google and Facebook, have been involved in the creation of pre-crime or predictive policing software as sort of a rather disturbing extension of their predictive ad algorithms and all of that. So why do you think these companies have become so interested in this type of pre-crime sort of Orwellian software, and what do you think that says about how they really operate today?
Yeah, well, it's like, look, I mean, if we go back a little bit, the whole origin of computer technology, right? Even if we go to the internet, so like to the 1950s, when America basically was freaking out about being bombed, basically being attacked with a nuclear bomb by the Soviet Union. So after the Soviet Union developed a nuclear bomb, it was the birth of this Cold War, right, where you had these two powers basically able to annihilate each other. And there was no ICBMs that were invented yet, but you had to deliver it with an airplane, right? So America was really worried about, there was an increasing number of airplanes in the sky at the time, and it's like, well, how can we find and track an enemy bombing squad, right? What if they try to mob us with like a swarm of airplanes? How can we keep track of this? There were primitive radar installations that were done by hand, and you had to track these, planes by hand, right, on a big kind of transparent dry eraser board. But it was so you could track airplanes, a little bit, but it wouldn't be enough to recognize that an attack is happening, and to recognize it early enough that you could actually intercept it. You can send, fire missiles at it or intercept it with enemy aircraft. And so the big worry in the early 1950s was that how do we build a system that can predict an attack, can identify if these are hostile aircraft, and it can predict where they're going to go and where they're going, and so that we can intercept the threat before they reach, American soil, right, and can drop the nuclear bomb. And so that led to this huge effort that resulted in the first nationwide computerized early warning radar system. It was called SAGE at the time, and basically it's sort of what people call NORAD now is kind of the modern version of that. But that initiative developed the first real-time computers that could process information in real time. They weren't like calculators that you fed stuff into, but could actually process information in real time like we're used to computers doing today. And it also spawned all this sort of new computer technology that we take for granted now, which is like basically a computer workstation with a screen that shows information, and like this primitive mice that you could sort of point at the screen and like they will open up menus. So it created this real-time computer system that was connected to these arrays, radar arrays that were far away, that were surveilling the world, right, surveilling this airspace, sending that information to these giant mainframes, sending that information in real time to a workstation, right, where an analyst is sitting and watching the sky, right, and if they saw something, was fishy, they'd try to figure out what's going on, and they'd scramble jets to intercept them, right. So it was that system, in a way, was the inspiration for the internet, because it showed that you could create a national network of computers that could watch the world in real time and abstract the real world like an airplane flying somewhere and carrying a bomb to a piece of information on a screen that an analyst could easily interact with and could make a decision based on that information very quickly, right? And so the idea was that why can't we do that for everything? Not just airplanes, but why can't we do that for political movements? Why can't we do that for the weather even? Why can't we do that for markets? Why can't we do that for battlefields, not just in the sky but on the ground, let's say in the jungles of Vietnam? Why can't we build these sort of real-time computer systems that watch the world, that sit over the world, on top of the world, watch the world, and can predict attacks, can predict conflicts, can predict troop movements, but also watched it in real time. So prediction and sort of an attempt to head off crime or attacks or whatever, right, before they happen, is sort of built in to the modern, the ideology, I guess, or the philosophy, or the way that computers are designed and thought about, right? It's all about monitoring the world and getting information so you can do something with that information. But it's very much tied to prediction. And so it's not surprising that you have Google closely partnering with a company like Predpol, which is a policing company based out here in California, that aims at sort of predicting future crime and sort of figuring out where in a city the crime will happen next, and then basically deploying police officers to that area as a way of deterring that crime from happening, right? there's a company like that. It sells its services to police agencies in all over America and around the world even. And Google is like really in love with that company. And when that company was first getting off the ground, Google worked very closely with it to develop visualization technology, but also customize some of its, I guess, data centers and data processing services that could help this company crunch numbers, crunch past crime patterns, so that they could predict future crime patterns. I mean, this is very much in line with, with generally what computers are for, and what Google is in the business of doing, which is predicting people's behavior. So it's not surprising that there's this giant overlap between the two.
And they've got so much data on us now. I mean, this might be a bit of a basic question, but could you give us and the listeners a little outline of what sort of data big companies and the government have on us, and what sort of techniques they can use to surveil us? I mean, can they listen to us through our phones or our TVs? And Orwellian seems a term that is often used to describe this, but of course in 1984, I remember it was one government spying on a quite unwilling and seemingly terrified population, whereas in our reality, it's like a great number of corporations are doing it, and we're all lining up enthusiastically to spend fortunes to help them do it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, Orwellian is like. Yeah, I mean, I'd say like, it's a pretty good novel, but as like a blueprint for what the world that we live in today, I don't think it's very good, right? Because first of all, 1984 presupposes like that a kind of a Soviet-style dictatorship is what sort of won out, right, and is what controls the world. Whereas actually, in reality, it's a kind of an American-style, national security sort of free market state that's really the power that controls the world in a way, right? That's what won out, and of course the surveillance there is of a different type, and people are a lot more scared of everything, whereas people are a lot more just kind of open and don't really care that they're sharing this information. I mean, the kind of information that they can collect in us is, you can just use your imagination, right? I mean, it's pretty much anything that you can think about. So, there's a microphone. I mean, it depends, where you draw the line. So there's the kind of if we trust these companies, right, that the microphones and that the cameras that are built into just about every device now, right, are, used only when we turn them on, or only when we use them, right? They collect information on our location, so we have our cell phone in our pocket. Wherever we go, we are, dragging essentially a little plot, right behind with us on a Google map, right, and they're recording that information. So if you were born, kids born today that get cell phones, as soon as they go to like middle school or whatever, high school, I mean, from that point on in their life, their movements are being completely tracked, right? But with that, it's not just your movement. You can watch people, who your friends are, even if you don't associate with people online, right? If you are in the same physical space and both of you have cell phones in your pockets, right? I mean, it shows that you're together, right? I mean, Google can very easily predict, one-night stands, or not predict, but can identify one-night stands or affairs, right? Very easily. I mean, if you think about it, I'm not sure if they're probably not doing it, but they could do that, and it could be an incredible blackmail engine if you think about it. Just if you think about what does an affair look like, let's say, right, on a map, in a person's life. So an affair would look like someone who's married, and Google knows if you're married or not, based on if you have Gmail, or if you have, credit cards that are connected, right, and have joint accounts with your wife or your spouse or your husband. So it knows that when people are married. But let's say someone goes to a bar and then goes to a location that they don't usually go to for the night with another person, and those two people spend that night there and separate in the morning, never to see each other again. And both of them, let's say, go back to their prospective spouses, let's just say, right? That is, you can just by watching people's movements, you can not predict, but you can observe things that, they're trying to hide from, obviously people that are closest to them. But so this is a very, very simple kind of crude example, but you can definitely find affairs. I mean, you can, there was a recent article in New York Times about how Google knows when women go to abortion clinics, even when they hide it from everybody else, and it serves them ads based on that. Because again, like, it's all about geolocation, right? And so if you go to an abortion clinic with your phone in your pocket, Google knows that, even if you try to hide it from everybody else, even if this private matter, this is between you and your healthcare provider, Google knows about it, even if you don't want to tell Google. So things like that, things that are of a very sensitive nature, that are not, it's not even communications between you and your doctor in Gmail or something, right? I mean, this is something that you're just going about your world, thinking that you're not being watched, thinking that no one knows. But Google and Facebook and anybody who's running a location aware service on your phone knows where you're going, right? But that also includes your telephone providers, right? Your cell phone providers. They also know where you are. So there's just like a dozen companies that are tracking you as you go along about your day, and you can't really do anything about that. You can't really do anything about that unless you stop using a cell phone, essentially, or carry your cell phone constantly in a Faraday like bag that prevents it from communicating with the external world, or only turn on your phone when you need to make a phone call. But of course, no one does that, because what's the point of having a phone? What's the point of having one of these smart devices if these smartphones, if that's what you do? We could probably talk for like hours, outlining all the different things, the information that all these companies can collect on you. But just, I think the location-based stuff is so sort of unspoken, right? And just the amount of information you can just get from people's movements, who they associate with, who their friends are, how much time they spend with people, with certain people, what their favorite places to spend their times are, your interests, your everything, and so it's just on that, in that dimension alone, it's incredible, and it's totally unregulated. No one thinks about this at all, and it's of course completely involuntary, right? It's not like you are entering things into Facebook and sharing things on Facebook. It's not like you're posting photos of yourself or your friends and the places you've been. It's not like you're even searching for anything on the internet, right? Or browsing the internet. You're just sort of walking around the world, and you are this kind of, to Google and to these other companies, you're kind of that blip on the radar screen, right? And they can click on you, and the menus expand, the information expands. Who you are, where you've been, where you were, when the last time was you were at that location, who you were with, all this stuff. It's pretty incredible. It's pretty incredible. Just the wealth of information that they have, and what's more incredible is that how completely unregulated or unencumbered they are. Right? There are no laws in America that restrict any of this stuff at all. There are more laws probably on like banks and financial companies that based on your financial information, because there are actually specifically laws passed in America in the 70s about privacy and that deal with some of the stuff, but like in terms of what Google can collect, not covered by any regulation or any law in America. It's kind of incredible.
Well, this sort of takes me back to the question I was asking you earlier about privatization. I sort of feel like if they hadn't gone, the private sector route, that the internet would have been, much more regulated maybe than it is now, and there would have been other sort of regulations, and it would have been hard for this sort of narrative that's emerged of the internet being sort of like this liberation for people and to help dissidents and all of that that you get into in the last part of your book. which I guess, now is as good a point as any to turn to that now. So in this part of your book, you get into some of your more controversial reporting, I guess, which I personally really admire, and I've referenced it in several of my reports, specifically about the Tor project, and some of these, celebrity privacy advocates like Jacob Applebaum and Edward Snowden, to name a few. So Tor, right, is this web browser that's marketed as secret and safe, or secure, and has been really heavily promoted, especially after, Snowden became more or less a household name in 2013. And as you point out in your book and in your past work at Pando, there is a lot more to Tor than meets the eye, and a lot of that is really in direct conflict with its public image. So, based on your research, why is Tor not what it seems, and do you think some of its most prominent supporters have ulterior motives in promoting it?
Well, yeah, I mean, Tor is, Tor is a U.S. government. So the Tor project that makes the Tor browser, it is a government, military contractor. Let's just start with that. So that's the first shocking thing when I first started kind of digging into it and looking at Tor. After really it became, yes, like you said, a household name and began to be promoted by all these privacy activists, and even some large corporations like Facebook, as a way of protecting your privacy on the internet. Well, the first thing you realize is that the Tor project has these sort of anarcho kind of radicals, anarchists, anarcho-capitalists, sort of working for it, and they see themselves as kind of these heroic figures who are fighting the U.S. government and surveillance on the internet, and the surveillance state and surveillance apparatus that's sort of taken over the internet by building and maintaining and teaching people how to use this really, really secure internet browsing system, which is supposed to anonymize your identity, right? Basically hide who you are on the internet while you're browsing it. And so there's this big sort of culture around it, and it's sort of, now it's not as big anymore, but in the Edward Snowden years, it was really front and center. I mean, you were talking about like cover stories for the Rolling Stone, really promoted, right? And, the first thing I found out was that all these radicals, who are fighting the U.S. surveillance state are actually being paid, are on the payroll of a military contractor called the Tor Project. The Tor Project is a nonprofit, but it's a nonprofit that gets most of its funding through government contracts. Government contracts from the State Department, contracts from the Pentagon, specifically the U.S. Navy, and contracts from what used to be known as the Broadcasting Board of Governors. Now it's called the U.S. Agency for Global Media, and that's sort of the umbrella, federal government umbrella that funds and oversees America's foreign broadcasting propaganda operations like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Radio Free Asia, and a bunch of other radio stations that cover most of the Middle East, most of Latin America and South America, and most of Eastern Europe, Asia, Russia, and all the Central Asian republics, of the former Soviet Union. So it's this. So the Tor Project gets most of its money from 3 government agencies, and it's like, wait, that's weird. How is that possible? Why? And and so the story has two different parts. One of the parts is that the origins of the Tor Project were really not about protecting privacy, people's privacy as we think about it. It was actually designed to protect the privacy of spies while they used the internet, not people, not activists. But spies. And it was supposed to solve a kind of a thorny problem for the government that arose when the internet went global, and the U.S. government agents like the FBI or the CIA wanted to use the internet to communicate or to do research or to investigate people. The problem is that because the internet has an open kind of address system, so anyone who's like a web admin can see the traffic that's coming, to their server, and can see kind of where it's originating from, the origin, right? And so that posed a problem because if let's say you're an FBI agent, sitting and doing, research on animal rights groups or something, you're trying to infiltrate an animal rights group, animal rights forum. The admin, if they look at, who you are, they can see that your IP address resolves to an FBI, field office somewhere, right? Then there was another problem that was posed for, let's say, agents that are out in the field and that want to dial home, and want to check basically their agency email address. Let's say you're a CIA agent sitting somewhere in the Middle East, and you're undercover, and you want to log in and check your messages. You can't just go into the CIA.gov, mail.cia.gov account, because anybody who's watching the ISP traffic coming out of your hotel room or something, right, will see that you're trying to log on to a CIA website. And so the idea was, how does the government create a system that can hide this activity? How can the government create a system that can separate sort of your, who you are, and basically like where you're coming from when you're using the internet, right, and what you're trying to access. And so the Tor project came out of that. So it was built by a team of engineers, computer scientists at the U.S. Navy, and it did that pretty well. And in the 2000s, it was sort of privatized and spun off into a nonprofit called the Tor Project, headed by one of the former researchers who helped develop the technology. His name is Roger Dingeldine, and until recently he was the head of the Tor Project. And so that's sort of the origin story of the Tor Project, where it came from. And then there's a second part of that story, is that it became, another agency took a very big interest in the Tor Project, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, who was at the time making this push of using the internet to beam anti-communist propaganda into China. And there was the beginning of this kind of war between China and America over the internet, when America was trying to weaponize the internet as a way of to deliver propaganda, right, into China, to beam into China. And so China began to block a lot of the websites of American government. So, like, Radio Free Asia was publishing all these broadcasts, and China said, we're just going to block Radio Free Asia so that people in China can't access this content. And so the U.S. government began to look around for technologies that could circumvent those blocks. And the Tor Project became one of the more powerful ones, the more effective ones, to do that. And so it became the Broadcasting Board of Governors, now known as the U.S. Agency for Global Media. They keep changing the damn name all the time, so it's almost impossible. It used to be, it's kind of ridiculous, and they give them these long names that no one knows, and so I get really, it's kind of annoying. So it used to be known as the BBG, but now people inside the government call it USAGM, like as the U.S. Agency for Global Media. Anyway, so they began funding the Tor Project in a big way, as a way of as a tool of censorship circumvention, right? As a tool that basically was designed to prevent governments from exercising control over internet, right, in their own domestic internet space.
Well, to clarify, this is just for countries that are, not aligned with the U.S., right?
Yes, because that's where the only problem exists, and
for
so
them, yeah.
Yes. So for America, you don't have. Yes, exactly. In Europe, which has its own, sort of laws, American companies have to comply with European laws, and certain content is blocked. Right? Let's say you can't sell Nazi paraphernalia in France, right? But the Tor Project could be used to circumvent that, most and get that content by people in France. So it's tricky. People still can use them to circumvent certain blocks that are thrown up, even if they're legal, and even if the U.S. doesn't really oppose them, right? On a sort of foreign policy level. But yes, I mean, these were directed specifically at first at China, and then, of course, it spread to other countries. And so the Tor project kind of took on this dual life, until it had this kind of dual life. And the first part of it, as far as like privacy activists and sort of internet activists saw it, was less of a privacy technology, right, and more of a internet circumvention, censorship circumvention technology, right? So, but it has this two dual sides to it. It helps people circumvent blocks, right, but also protects their privacy. And so the internet circumvention was funded by kind of one agency, but the two are kind of two sides of the same coin, because by hiding your identity and where you're going, you can sort of get around censorship blocks on the internet. And so, almost, if you look at the funding of the Tor project, almost all of it comes from the government. So, the Tor project built up this reputation as a grassroots organization, right? That they would have these fundraising drives, and they would try to collect money from people, and made a big show of this, of collecting money from a bunch of different donors. But actually, when you drill down and look at the financial, you realize that like anywhere from 85 to 95% of the money, depending on the year, came from the U.S. government. And it came from the U.S. government for these two purposes that I just talked about.
Right, okay. So turning really quickly to one of these most famous advocates of Tor, who I mentioned earlier, Edward Snowden. You raised some points in your book too that have crossed my mind, and I'm sure the minds of some people that have been watching what's happened in the years since he first came public. These include things like how Snowden has promoted Tor really heavily, also Signal, which also has some similar issues related that are similar to Tor's problems that you just discussed. Also, Snowden. When he did interviews after coming public, he was apparently unaware of this, nexus between these private Silicon Valley monopolies and the government, and said that only the government was doing wrong and the private companies he sort of treated as somewhat innocent, even though that collusion is really clear in a lot of the documents he released. And, and also the fact, going back to Tor, that some of the documents that Snowden released showed that the NSA basically thought that Tor was a honey trap, but then he goes and he promotes it anyway. And also since your book came out, as everyone is probably aware by now, The Intercept, which was founded in part to publish the Snowden documents, they recently closed their archive of those documents, and over 5 years they published like well under 10% of all those files. Yes. And, Snowden, who ostensibly, gave up his freedom, he's now unable to return to the United States, and, has to live in exile forever, presumably. He hasn't really complained about that happening and how his leaks were basically, privatized and cut off. Aside from, a couple comments that he made as an aside in an interview with Vice, and he didn't really have any objections, which, seems kind of weird. I don't know. So, do you have any thoughts on that as a whole?
I mean, yeah, I think, look, I think Snowden, I see Snowden as a kind of as a tragic character, who is trapped in his own ideologies and in his own alliances, right? That are political alliances. So the ideology part of it is that he, if you actually look at, what Snowden believes, he's a pretty hardcore libertarian who believes that, the government and politics, sort of mass politics, social movements and politics are not really what changes things, right? It's technology that changes the world. It's the technology that can save the world. It's companies creating technology, engineering things. So he doesn't believe in political solutions to political problems. He believes in technological solutions to political problems. And, he makes that clear in a lot of different speeches that he gives, because he makes a bit of money, kind of has a career, giving talks to business groups, to all sorts of groups, remotely, right? And what's come out after sort of he's had to flee to Russia, and is that, this belief, his really earnest and deep belief in the idea that only technology can solve political problems. He says it over and over and over again. And so in a way, his belief in in Tor and Signal, which is, this encrypted chat app that is also funded by the Broadcasting Board of Governors, or now called the U.S. government, U.S. Agency for Global Media, was funded by that. So you have these two main privacy tools, Signal and Tor, both funded by the U.S. government. And so he believes it, so he's kind of trapped in this way. His whole worldview is based on that. And so what do you do if your worldview is all about, promoting tools like the Tor project and tools like Signal? And yet when you're faced with information showing that, there's something kind of deeply wrong here. If these tools are so dangerous to the U.S. government, if they're so dangerous to its surveillance capabilities, why is the same government funding them, and funding them lavishly, and actually increasing funding for these tools the more that they're used by the public to expose government secrets and to hide from the government, right? It doesn't make sense. But he's trapped in his own ideology in that way, so he can't really step outside of that because he believes that these tools are the thing that will solve the surveillance and that'll fix surveillance. Political action, limiting the surveillance capabilities of the United States or the surveillance practices of the United States through political action, right? Actually dismantling some of these programs, reducing the size of this national security state and the scope of it and its charter, right? These are not something that he believes in. He thinks that they're corrupt, that ultimately a corruption will creep in to this political process, and will actually, maybe even end up doing more harm than good. And so he believes in these tools, and so he's trapped, and he's trapped into either advocating for them, for their use, or at least going silent when it's become more clear that these tools are very much intertwined with the U.S. national security state. So that's one part of it. The part of it is about him not complaining about, the fact that The Intercept basically shut down his own archive, right? The documents that he risked his liberty, right, his freedom to rescue, to liberate from the U.S. national security state and to share with the public have been basically privatized and shut down, right, are not being shared with the public. The fact that it's the whole point of his action, right, and it's why he's in exile today. He's being shut down. The reason I think he's not critical of this is because he has made an alliance with the people from The Intercept, in a sense that they are his promoters, they are his champions, right? Who does he have, to advocate for his interests, right? In America, very few people, And so it's like, what is he going to go against? Glenn Greenwald, an extremely powerful, influential journalist and pundit who has his back and has built his career off of Edward Snowden, really, right? And the leaks that he provided. Is he going to go against him? Is he going to burn this last bridge that he has to at least some people in power and influence in America that can sort of advocate on his behalf? And so, of course he wouldn't. Of course he wouldn't do that. He'd isolate himself even further. And so, I think it's kind of tragic in that sense. Because he has very few options, not only ideologically but also politically, to maneuver. He really kind of has to go along with whatever The Intercept does, and whatever the principles that The Intercept feel like doing. I mean, I haven't been following this too much because I've been doing other things, but I would imagine that he's also not extremely vocal on the Edward Assange issue, right?
Well, to an extent, yeah. I mean, he has tweeted about it, but it's not exhaustive, I mean, he definitely has tweeted more about stuff going on in the EU with their internet privacy laws than he has about Assange. I think that's and we've seen with sort of Assange has been completely right. I mean, has been completely thrown under the bus, cut off. But by the very people who built their careers on his leaks, right? So the whole Assange kind of built up this whole, for the lack of a better word, industry, this sort of privacy industry, this industry that's all about,
encouraging leakers or protecting data, and encouraging, the leaking of government secrets and corporate secrets, and this kind of privacy, internet activism world. It really erupted after WikiLeaks, and a lot of people made their careers off them, including a lot of people who were involved in The Intercept. And so, the fact that that whole world turned on him, basically, right?
Right. Well, I think also to an extent, Snowden got turned on too, because it came out that when they decided to shut down the archive, Snowden wasn't even notified until days later. They didn't involve him at all in that decision. So that definitely makes the situation, for either Assange and Snowden on both sides, even more tragic, and really, should bring scrutiny at least to the journalists that sort of have, the ability to speak up for these people and have become their advocates. The actions they're sort of taking behind the scenes. I don't know. It's
exactly
a troubling situation for sure.
Well, look, it's like Edward Snowden is really screwed because, he's in Russia, right? Already, he's, this American hero who fled to Russia, and Russia is the center of all evil, as far as sort of the American establishment is concerned. So he's there basically, he has to stay in the good graces of the Russian government, which is, puts him in that position. He's also can't really, take positions that are really, I don't know, he doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver because he's seen as like a pawn of the Russian government by a lot of people, and he's like, like, what does this word matter even anymore, right? he's in a way, so he can be so easily discredited or shut down or shut up, right? Because, just because of the nature of, where he's at. And so it's like, he really doesn't have a lot of allies, and not a lot of people, and people who kind of maybe are his allies aren't really willing to stick their neck out for someone like him anymore, because he is, a liability, much, especially after Russiagate. So it's.
Well, talking about Russiagate, as a Russian-born American journalist and internet and cybersecurity expert, and having worked for a long time in Russia, and you're perhaps in a somewhat unique position in actually having cared about Vladimir Putin or authoritarianism when he was still America's friend, and yet we've all seen hostility towards Russians reach new levels in the US recently with supposed Russian online interference in the elections across Europe and in the US, and accusations of, Russian anchor babies, and even James Clapper saying that Russians are genetically predisposed to lie and cheat. What's been the consequences of Russiagate for Russians in the US?
Well, I think there's widespread disillusionment with the American liberal establishment, right? Because this Russiagate it's been a very confusing time for a lot of Russian immigrants, and I think it's very difficult for them to voice really what's the problem or really to figure stuff out. I think a lot of people have just sort of pretended this isn't existing, this doesn't exist, and that just sort of unplug. And for a lot of others, it's pushed them, to the right and towards the Trump camp, even more so because strangely enough, it's like. You turn on MSNBC, well, it's not strangely enough, you turn on MSNBC and you're being demonized, right? And you're being, everything is being blamed on these sort of shadowy Russians. And you turn on Fox News and that's not there, right? It's that kind of demonization based on your ethnic identity is non-existent. Of course, on Fox News, the other ethnicities are being demonized, and those ethnicities that might not be being demonized as much, maybe, or to such an extent on MSNBC. So it's pushed people a lot definitely to the Trump camp and to the Republican camp. And I think it's on some level it's also signaled the end of this kind of naive period in sort of the lives of Soviet immigrants, because who I'm talking about now are actually Soviet immigrants, people who came to America mostly, at the latter days of the Soviet Union, from Russia, but all over the place,
etc.
But from Ukraine, from Russia, from the Baltic states, from Central Asian states, from all over the place. So it's the former Soviet Union. So people have come here, and it's been now, almost 30 years for many people, maybe for some 40 years. And all this time they had the luck to be in this sort of privileged immigrant group. They were not demonized like a lot of other immigrant groups. They were not seen as non-white or a threat to the American way of life until very recently. So they were always seen as a privileged group in a way that the American state really did everything it could to facilitate and ease immigration out of the Soviet Union for mostly Jewish Soviet Jews, and did everything on the sort of the American side to soften the blow of immigration. Right, made people eligible for social benefits, for welfare, for public housing, all these things. There are special laws passed for that. That made Soviet immigrants sort of eligible for that, or other immigrants are not necessarily eligible for. And so there's been this, and of course the reason for that is because the Soviet Jews were seen as a weapon against the Soviet Union, as it was a way of weakening the Soviet Union and forcing it to sort of release people and open its borders. And so, Soviet Jews were seen as kind of pawn in the geopolitical fight between the Soviet Union and America. And so there were a protected group, a privileged group of immigrants here in the States. And that is kind of, well, to some degree, is at least rhetorically, and what you see it being pumped out by mainstream news outlets and TV networks, that is coming to an end. And now Russians are seen as a threat to the American way of life because Russians are seen almost as on a genetic level as kind of linked to, the master, the queen, Putin, and the queen insect bug Putin who's sitting in the Kremlin, and it's potentially doing, his bidding. And so it's been disconcerting and disorienting for a lot of people. At this point, of course, it's only the beginning of this. So it's, hard to say what the long range effects of this or where this will be headed. But, clearly there's a renewed xenophobic panic in America. And it's targeting the Russian communities, but it's also targeting Chinese American communities increasingly. And so, this panic isn't going away anytime soon, I think, because it's been very useful politically. And so I think that in the short term, really what it's done is pushed a lot of Russian immigrants or Soviet immigrants further to the right, away from the Democratic Party, away from progressive politics, and towards, Donald Trump, which is not surprising, I guess.
Well, it's interesting to view this in the context of American history because, in especially in the early 20th century, there were all these sort of manufactured, hysterias against immigrants.
Yes.
And, ostensibly, at least what we were all taught in schools or whatever, the U.S. is past that. It was supposed to be past, that sort of era, right? But what we've seen is a new one sort of start in a new and disturbing way. So sort of to follow up on what you were talking about, you also wrote an article recently that's related to this where you sort of describe Russiagate, how it's been sort of treated as sort of like a huge failure of mainstream media. Like Glenn Greenwald, who we were talking about earlier, talked about how this was like an abysmal failure for the mainstream media. But you argue that it's actually been a success, at least from this perspective of the people who really started this whole Russiagate, not necessarily the talking heads on TV, but where all this really came from. Could you expound on that briefly?
Well, yeah, the Russiagate and blaming Russia for swinging the election towards Donald Trump is really a great way of shifting away attention and shifting away blame from the Democratic Party and more broadly, the liberal political establishment in America. We're shifting attention away from them for losing to this freaking, idiot clown. And losing this election to this idiot clown, right? From them and their policies that they've overseen for the last, 40 years, 50 years, they've taken a part in, that have really brought America to a very sad state for a lot of people who live in this country. It's a really tough place to live and to survive. basically blaming, that and pretending none of that exists. That there are no problems in America, and that actually the problem is a foreign government, an inscrutable foreign enemy that's sort of doing its voodoo through the internet, through the shadowy ways of influencing America and American ideas and American voters, and basically helping Donald Trump win the election. So it's blaming domestic political problems, and there are many domestic political problems. There's problems no matter where you look, what part of the society you look. Blaming it on a foreign enemy, a totally inflated threat. Obviously, there's geopolitical, geopolitical maneuvering and geopolitical conflict, right, that exists between pretty much any nation state, even friendly ones, on some level. But but the Russian threat has been inflated to such a degree and blamed for all America's problems. And so, in that sense, yes, it's been successful because it's given, the media and the political class cover, and it's giving them something to talk about, and giving them something to investigate, giving them something to focus their energies on, and to focus people's energies on, because that's very important, and to really redirect people's attention away from their own culpability, and redirecting sort of people's attention from that, so they don't have to reckon with it politically, and that the political class that brought basically Donald Trump to power, the Democratic Party and the liberal establishment that brought Donald Trump to power, it has allowed them to keep staying in power, right? And so, in that sense, it's been very effective, very much so. And so, yeah, I mean, it's it's interesting. Like, the Russiagate stuff is basically we keep people think that racism or xenophobia is something that at least a lot of liberals think so, and even I have to say, think it just exists somewhere in the back of my mind. That racism and xenophobia kind of comes from the lower classes. Comes from the down there, and sort of boils up to the surface. And that racism, outright racism, doesn't really exist in liberal culture like that, right? It can't be. I mean, it really comes from like the Hicks, the Red Staters, the truck, the guys with the truck nuts, like that's where the racism is. It doesn't really, hang out in Rachel Maddow's studio. And what Russiagate showed so clearly, right? Because it took this foreign enemy, Russia is like such a faraway place. It's so removed from America and from American politics, really. That no one's really racist against Russians in America, right? Not really. It's not like it's of course very different with Muslim Americans or Mexican Americans, right? I mean, there is a real sort of grassroots hatred based on religious and based on cultural history and political history, right? That's rooted in America. But Russia is like this thing, it's Russophobia. It doesn't really come from the bottom. It doesn't really exist, on the streets, right? And so what's been interesting about watching Russiagate is how the xenophobic campaign really is top-driven, right? And how you can see it, how it originates, and how these things are whipped up, and how these things are generated. And they're generated through national cable networks, through very, very respectable newspapers, national newspapers, and it comes from the top of our political and media establishment, liberal political media establishment. And that's been kind of very interesting to watch from almost like a sociological level, because you see how racist campaigns and xenophobic campaigns are really top-driven, and they're politically driven, and of course they're being top-driven. And it's been interesting to see that, right? Because if you're talking about Fox News' hatred of immigrants from the South, or Muslim Americans, it's harder to see where that hatred is coming from in a way, right? Because it does exist in culture more broadly. And so Russiagate, that doesn't exist, and so it's been interesting to see it in this pure, almost laboratory state, right, where you can see it develop and see it sort of start as just a top-driven media campaign, nothing else, and develop into something real. And we're still in the very early stages of that, and we'll see where it'll lead.
Yeah, exactly. We've already taken an hour of your time, Yasha. I know you had to go. So we want to thank you very much for being on the MintCast, and hopefully we can get you back on soon to talk about, more revelations that come up.
No, thanks. It was a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, that was our interview with Russian-born writer and journalist Yasha Levine. His latest book is Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet. You can follow him on Twitter at Yasha Levine and at yasha.substack.com. That was this week's MintCast, the official podcast for Mint Press News. You can help us by sharing this podcast on social media or supporting us at patreon.com/mintpressnews. For Whitney Webb and myself, until next time, stay fresh.